JWT stands for JSON Web Token, and it is, as the name would imply, something that's often used as a token that is based on JSON. It's actually pronounced JWT and is an IETF standard. So you can actually go read RFC 7519. It's 10 or 12 pages, and it lays out this specification. It's important to know that JWTs can be signed or encrypted. With a signed JWT, you have a signature which allows anybody who's consuming the JWT to know that the data in the JSON Web Token has not been tampered with. But anyone who gets their hands on the JWT can see the contents of the data or the payload. Encrypted JWTs, on the other hand, as the name implies, are encrypted. The payload is encrypted using a key, and no one without that key can read the contents of it. In my experience, signed JWTs are far more prevalent than encrypted JWTs, but you need to be aware that both exist. So JWTs are often used as stateless portable tokens of identity. I'm going to break that apart and explain a little bit more about each of those phrases. So when I say stateless, I mean that you can verify the contents of a JWT without ever talking to a central server. So they're self-contained in that way, and that means that they can scale pretty well because you can have one entity, an identity provider, create a JSON Web Token, hand that JSON Web Token to another entity, someone providing an API, and the second entity can rest assured that whatever the JSON Web Token says hasn't been changed, hasn't been tampered with, without ever contacting the initial creator of the JSON Web Token. When I say they're portable, I mean that they can be turned into a string that's HTTP friendly. Because they are base64 encoded in a URL friendly manner, then they can be put any place in an HTTP request. So that can be a header, it can be in a cookie, it can be in a form parameter. You can even put it in an actual URL if you know what you're doing. That's not something we typically recommend. And then when we say the tokens of identity, this is a very typical use case for a JSON Web Token. Either a person or a service wants access to something, and in order for the system that controls access to that resource to make sure the access is granted when it's appropriate and not granted when it's not, it needs to know what is requesting the access. And that's what a JWT can provide. Because of those three attributes, JWTs are great for APIs and microservices. Again, because of the scenario where you have a central server that is an identity provider that takes care of the credential management and then generates this JSON Web Token, and then that JSON Web Token can be handed to a client, and that client can present it to various other services that can rest assured they know the identity of the requester without ever talking to the central server. Because of this, and because it's a standard that's relatively old and well known, JWTs are produced by many different identity providers. These are identity providers such as Fusion Auth, Auth0, and others. And I will say that in my experience, JWTs, in contrast to some other token formats, are really widely supported. I have not run into any language that doesn't have support for parsing and generating JSON Web Tokens. And that's what you should do. You should absolutely use a library to handle your JSON Web Tokens, preferably an open source library. JWTs are very powerful tools. There are enough edge cases that it's actually a really good idea to use a library that's been examined and used by a lot of other people. So that is JSON Web Tokens briefly. Thank you.